Hey guys, we're back at it with the 2015 Viking. Got everything wrapped up as you had seen in the past handful of videos with the rebuild of that engine using the Grizzly crankcase. Things went together pretty well. We got the engine back into the machine and it runs really nicely. Started right up. I didn't have to hardly crank on anything. I made sure all the fluids were topped off. Went through the coolant bleeding procedure to burp the lines, get all the air bubbles out of it and make sure coolant was getting to the engine. And in the end, the machine runs really nicely. What I did find though is that under idle, when it's just kind of sitting there, it really vibrates. And I think from what I've been reading on the different forums and things, this is due to it just being a very large single cylinder. So it's really throwing a lot of mass around as it's idling. It's hardly noticeable at all when you're actually driving though. It seems like it's very smooth over the terrain, as well as there's no real engine vibration that you feel of unless you're at some low idle speed or something like that. So what I ended up doing was purchasing the parts to implement a 2016 design change to the Viking that they hadn't rolled in the original 2014 and 2015 models. And what that is it's actually a dampener arm that mounts on the top end of the cylinder and suppresses some of that motion forward and back by tying that to the frame rather than letting it kind of be a free hanging pendulum like it is currently in the design. So it took a long time getting those parts actually shipped to me. I had them on order for over a month and a half. And I don't know, just due to some OEM problems, they weren't able to locate the parts. I suppose at this point it's a 9-year-old model, so maybe those parts have gone obsolete. Nevertheless, I got the parts in hand now, so I've got the full kit, and I kind of just wanted to give you guys a show of what it takes to install this dampening kit. So here's proof. The machine is back together, the engine's back in it. What we'll be looking to do is this dampener actually installs on this top kind of lug section of the top end cylinder. And it's kind of an arm with some bushings and brackets that tie it back to a location underneath the heat shield. So I'm going to have to cut a hole in the heat shield to bring that over. But what that should do is, like I said, keep the rocking motion from going back and forth from the single cylinder. A lot of the other side-by-side models have like a four-cycle engine a four-cylinder engine, two-cylinder engine, something where the opposing piston is dampening some of that motion by itself. Not the case for these Viking engines with a single large bore cylinder like this. So I'm hoping that this will make a difference. I will do a quick before and after video so you can at least see the vibration. It's going to be exaggerated a little bit because I've got the dump bed up at the moment. But nevertheless, at least I can use it for my own reference to see if it's made a difference.
I can't tell how well that's actually catching that because the vibration might be at the same frame rate that I'm capturing at right now. But in essence, I mean, when you're in the vehicle, you actually feel the seats and everything really vibrating when you're at idle.
Like I've mentioned though, I don't think it's actually a build problem. You'll remember in some of my videos, I was debating on whether or not to use the Grizzly or the Viking balancer of the crankshaft. I ended up going with the original Viking size balancer, even though it was the new crankcase. So I think I've talked myself around that because I think I'd have larger problems going like under speed when I'm kind of driving across a terrain. Since it's only a problem at idle, I'm pretty confident that this dampening mechanism will give me a little bit of benefit here. Is this kit that I had ordered, all genuine Yamaha parts. Essentially, this is the main structural kind of part of it, though, is that you've got this long arm that's going to connect, and I know this picture kind of truncates it a little bit, but you've got this long arm that's going to install to the top end, right onto the frame of the side-by-side, and then the other end is going to come in and connect to that point on the top cylinder of the engine, like I had pointed out earlier. In hindsight, a lot of these parts, I mean, there's some of these that are kind of unique, but it's like I probably didn't need to order the actual hex nuts and things that were called out in the OEM drawing. Had I been a little bit more patient, I probably could have looked up and found what the length and thread series and things were. But I ended up just going for the OEM part numbers to save myself a little bit of time. I think this is going to be a pretty straightforward assembly, so let's see how it goes. All right, so like I had mentioned earlier, the parts diagram doesn't really have any call outs or anything for the parts, so it's a little difficult to piece to like where parts are going together. I think I've got it figured out though here. I've got everything unwrapped. This is the bracket that'll be going up against the top of the engine. And then this is kind of what I'll call a sway bar or something like that, a dampening arm that connects the top of the engine to the chassis. What these are these little rubber bushings. Oh, out of frame there. These little bushings have a slight nub on them, if you can see that. And what they'll do is they'll actually just press fit into the ends of this, aligning the nub here. And so that's the case for both sides. I suppose you could probably put a little bit of engine oil or something on here just to slide it in a little bit easier, but as you can see, it's not too terrible. So that comes through, and that'll get kind of swaged in place a little bit as it gets tightened. We'll do the same thing to this side. Like I said, just making sure that when you're pressing it together, you've got that small nub kind of in place so that it doesn't rotate around once it's tightened. Best I can tell, so there's a slight bend to one side. I believe this will be what's going against the chassis. So in the orientation that I've got the side-by-side right now, this is the rear end of the side-by-side. The part will be going like this with the bent end coming down into the chassis frame. So with that, I'm going to kind of like lay parts out a little bit. It's not actually going to be installed at the moment. These are little metal and rubber washers. One side being kind of a dense rubber and the other side is got a metal so that you don't over compress the rubber. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the counterbore section over top of this bushing that's already in place on the control arm. And I think that, to me, that makes the most sense. And then of those, it's a larger diameter hex nut. A hex bolt that's going to go in here. And that's going to come down, again, to the rear end of the frame. And what I believe I'm seeing is that this kind of nut plate is going to be used to secure it to the chassis. So it's going to go like this. And I'll show this in another camera view in a moment. So it's going to go like that, and we've got a secondary nut just keeping this plate up, a secondary bolt to keep the nut up or plate up. So that's what the back end would look like. And then what we'll do is we'll start messing around with the bracket side to show what that would look like. So I'm going to turn this around just so that it kind of is oriented the same way as this diagram. So if I'm bringing it that way, I've got the bushing already in on one side, and I'm going to take the washer with the rubber on it. Same way with the counterbore going in towards that barrel of the bushing. So I've got it placed like that. And it looked to me, and I suppose this will become a little bit more obvious once I actually get it in place, but it looked to me like this is going on in this orientation. So this arm gets mounted on like this. There's a big spacer that's used between the two. Seems like maybe that's an oddly shaped bracket for what it needed to do. And then they're having the nut from the top coming on this side. Sorry, the bolt from this side. And they've got a hex nut on the other side. These look like they've got slight serrations on them, so it's probably a locking nut. And then this guy, this is what would tie it this would tie it into the top of the engine, flipping it around to the actual orientation of the Viking I'm working on. And this would come in from the opposite side. So my bolt came in from this side. I'm going to take this one and bring it in from this side. And again, it's going to have a little hex nut on it there. Now the part that's got me a little confused, I'm going to put the screw in there like they are showing. It doesn't make sense to me what the purpose of it is. But there's this little panhead Phillips screw with an additional nut. And they're showing them getting pre-assembled like that. And then installed here. Now the nut I know would just be to kind of keep it locked at a certain height. And I'm assuming on the engine this will be a little bit more apparent. But I think what it is an end stop. So once you get this bracket installed, it'll act like an end stop. So here's kind of what I believe the bracket's meant to look like when it's in place. As I mentioned, we've got this brackety end up against what I'm going to call a knuckle or something on the top end of the cylinder. There's a through hole coming through this way that aligns with this bolt. And I've found that what this screw is, I believe, is a tensioning or rather a tightening method. So once you have this bracket in place, you'll actually run this in until it bottoms out on this face of the knuckle, and that'll keep this thing from rolling around too much. Being that this is a 2015 Viking though, it doesn't have all of the mounting holes that are required. So what I'm going to end up doing is drilling a hole in this frame here, actually 2 holes, about here and here. I'm going to use this as a template, and that'll allow me to have a through hole that I can pass these through, and then this nut plate will actually install from the bottom side where I can catch it with these bolts. So I think that makes sense as far as how I would picture that going together. The intent here is that, like I mentioned multiple times, all you're doing is dampening the top end motion of this cylinder. You've got the rubber bushings installed on both ends of this connecting rod, and that's hopefully supposed to help out a little bit. It seems like a fairly simple kit. There's probably a dozen other ways you could do this, but to be honest, I was getting a little bit lazy, so I went with the OEM approach. I think maybe if I were to reconsider it based on the parts that I actually purchased, you could probably fabricate something just as easy that would work just as well. So I've got the nut plate held upside down. It'll actually be going on the other way around, but I just wanted to do it this way. I've got it approximately centered between these cutouts on the frame, and then also centered on the overall crossbar. What I had seen when I had that bracket kind of mocked up in place is that it sure looks like it's centered here. And I know that those bushings will give me a little bit of leeway in case I'm slightly off kind of in this lateral axis. And then with this bracket, I ought to be able to adjust with that set screw here. I ought to be able to adjust that and get that tight so that it's probably got some kind of like pre-tension or preload on it that'll keep it. It's probably not like exactly nominal position, so that it's got some pre-tension. It'll keep it from swaying right off the bat. That's a burnt out DeWalt there. So with this heat shield in place, I'm going to use those holes that I just drilled. I'm actually going to mark the bottom sides of this so I can kind of transfer those holes up and into the heat shield. The reason being is that, at least on this back end, those nuts can just pass right through. Those bolts can just pass right through. So I've got them here and here. On the front side though, what I think I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to cut kind of a little round to allow myself to get this bracket down into place. Notionally, I'm going to cut it probably bigger than this, but it's probably going to be kind of a horseshoe shaped, or maybe just, you know, kind of a squared off shape, something like that. So at least with this back end, I ought to be able to hold that nut plate up, and then I can bring this guy through like this. What I'm not quite sure yet is if this bushing has got a wide enough diameter to start getting in the way of this bend, and if it does, maybe I have to cut a small notch here as well. We'll see. I gotta be honest, folks, I'm not quite sure how that's gonna work to dampen that. I know that this is what they do use on the newer models, so it must be somewhat effective, but at least with my loose fit here, it sure seems kind of flimsy. Maybe I'll surprise myself once I get it all back together. Yeah. So I just wanted to throw these on here to give myself a little bit of a sense for where they actually will reside with relation to that heat shield. And I'll start marking that. I'm not going to tighten this top bolt all the way yet, just so that I can swing it around a little bit. So with respect to this little tensioner here, it looks like it's using a 10 millimeter hex nut on it to kind of keep it in position. And I'm not really tightening this thing too far. Part of the reason that I think a Phillips head was used is that Phillips heads were actually designed so that you can't over torque them. You'll pop your driver out before you strip the bolt usually. So I'm just going to put a little bit of pressure on there. And again, that's kind of butting into the cast aluminum of the head. So I'm going to put a little bit of pressure on there, and then I'm going to tighten it with that 10 millimeter hex nut. This lower section is already tight, and then this upper one, I've taken the slop out of it, but it's still loose enough that I can flex it out of the way as needed. So lining up this heat shield on here, I've already got the new holes drilled. And I think what I'm going to do is you can kind of see how far offset the hole in the frame is from where I want it to be with this heat shield. I mean, to be honest, it's not probably much more than 3/8 of an inch. And that's about how far this heat shield needs to slide over for the holes to align. So what I think I'm going to do is just take 3/8 of an inch off of here. That'll take this lip out of the way so that this can come down without deflecting the heat shield. And then the other check is to take this washer. We'll just line this up on here, and it does look like that can clear this bend all right. So I shouldn't have to cut this bend, and all I really need to do is take about 3/8 of an inch at the full width. You know, I'll go half an inch. A half an inch would take this bend all the way out. So all I'm going to do is just notch it here and bring it around. And that should be okay. I've got everything pretty well aligned laterally. So I think if I just use the bracket in its place as kind of a reference, I don't know, I'll give myself a little bit of wiggle room. Something like that. And like I said, I'm going to come down just to about where this bend is. One of the ways that I might actually do this is actually just to nib this bend and fold it over. That way I'm not left with a sharp edge there. And also that would give me a little bit of extra strength right at that area. So maybe that's what I'll do here. Okay, so we've got the bend in place. I guess if I was going to do this again, I probably would have gone a little bit further. My cut ended up being about 5/8 of an inch in this direction, and then I rolled up this edge and kind of doubled it over just so that it had a little bit of strength to it. I know it's not the prettiest thing. I am by far a metal worker. I don't have many tools for that kind of stuff, but I think it'll probably do for what I need. I've got the holes lined up. I can verify that this will clear everything without a problem. So I think we're at the point where we can start putting things back together. Let's see, so we got this nut plate's going to come in from underneath. These are all, I believe they're 14 millimeter bolts being used. Yeah. So I can get that guy in place. This next one will come over. He's going to come here. And just like anything, I mean, there's no need to tighten everything down until you get everything kind of aligned and such. There's enough play in the system that you want to give yourself a little bit of freedom putting things back together. Here, and I say that, and I've already got this guy tight, so better back him out. Got to thinking as I'm doing this, I've also got to make sure I keep this heat shield aligned. Otherwise, I'll be fighting that as well. The heat shield uses a 12 millimeter set of bolts. Probably a little bit of overkill, but I'll just use what they gave me. Now that I've got the heat shield all aligned, I know I still have my clearance up here to this bracket, and I think I can wrench these down. As this isn't really a technical part of the 2015 build, I don't really have a torque spec for it, so I'm just going tight. As I mentioned before, these are serrated nuts that are being used with these bolts, so they're going to lock anyways. I didn't really notice if that was the case on the nut plate or not. I suppose if you were kind of being anal about it, you could probably put some Loctite or something on the threads, maybe the blue on there. Before I get the bed back on the side-by-side, I'll give you a quick overview of what this entailed. You know, I've probably only been working on this for about an hour. It's an afternoon after work, so pretty quick and easy job if you get all the parts in hand. We had the bracket here. We press fit the bushings into this control arm, built up the bracket with the bolts and locking hex nuts, and that gets installed on the top end of the cylinder. We've got the control arm coming across. There's a nut plate on the bottom side of this. We had to modify this rail with 2 holes so that we could put in these new nuts and bolts, or sorry, these new bolts kind of passing through. That it cinches everything. I had been questioning whether or not this bent end was towards the front or the back of the side-by-side. It's pretty apparent. It goes towards the back. It kind of follows the contours of this heat shield. To get the heat shield modified, pretty simply pop 2 holes in here that align with the nut plate. And in the front, just cut kind of a recess, a clearance around that bracket. I had originally thought 3/8 of an inch. I don't think it hurts to go a little bit bigger. So in the end, I ended up going about 5/8 inch deep, and then just folded things over and kind of swaged it with one of my hammers. So that gives me pretty ample clearance. I don't think we'll have any problems with that vibrating or knocking into that. But I suppose that'd be something to keep an eye on as we turn it back on once it's all built back up. Okay guys, there's another one in the books. We put the vibration dampening arm on top of the cylinder, buckled that down to the chassis, and all in all it only probably took about a half an hour of time, or an hour and a half of time. Not too bad. I would say the parts were a little bit expensive. I mean, getting the Yamaha OEM set was around $200 shipped. And it's, I mean, as you can see, it's dark now. We're getting close to winter, so it's a lot darker earlier in the evening. But we're after dinner, and I got a chance to kind of rip it around the yard. I would say that it's a modest improvement to the vibration at idle. Not really a noticeable difference to like the driving vibration, because that was never really a problem to start with. But at least for idle, there's a modest improvement. Not as great as what I was hoping for, or maybe expecting, but nonetheless, I suppose it doesn't hurt anything, because if anything, it's maybe relieving some of the stress of those bushings underneath from shaking as much as they do. Some of the other things, you know, that I've played around with this side-by-side. This is the first one I've owned, so maybe this is just typical of side-by-sides, but there's a lot of plastic parts on it that tend to rattle and things, so I've been using like foam tape, making sure everything's kind of buttoned down to help prevent that from rattling too much. Overall though, you know, not as good of improvement as what I was hoping for. I guess maybe let me know in the comments, or shoot me a message or something if you guys have tried this as well and had maybe better luck than what I'm expecting, and what I've experienced here. I suppose that's probably enough for this video. Next video, you know, we picked up some used tires and wheels that we're going to be installing. Pretty simple, straightforward thing. I know most of you guys know how to do it, but I'm excited to see how it changes the look of the overall side-by-side. So stay tuned. We'll catch you guys on the next one.